June 6, 1944. Southwick House, Portsmouth, England. The war had dragged on for years, but today was different. Today, everything was at stake. Eisenhower stood in the map room, tension thick in the air. He had not slept in 2 days, and the exhaustion was starting to show. His face, usually calm, was now pale with worry. All around him, officers scrambled to deliver reports, their faces grim. The Allied invasion of Normandy was happening now, but reports from the beaches were already troubling. Omaha was a nightmare. Men were dying on the sand, pinned down by German machine guns, and nothing was going as planned. The Allies had hoped to move swiftly, but at Omaha Beach, it felt like they were stuck in the mud. No one had expected this much resistance. Then, the radio crackled, and the news hit like a shockwave. A young officer burst into the room, his face pale, holding a piece of paper. He handed it to Eisenhower. The Supreme Commander read it once, then read it again. He looked up, eyes wide. "The Canadians are through. 47 minutes," he said quietly. The room fell silent. In under an hour, the Canadian forces had achieved what seemed impossible, breaching the German defenses at Juno Beach faster than anyone had expected, accomplishing in minutes what others had struggled to do for hours. The others in the room stared at Eisenhower. They had expected the Canadians to face the same horrors as the rest of the invasion, but this was different. This was something no one had seen coming. The Canadians had accomplished the unimaginable. They had breached the German defenses in a fraction of the time anyone thought possible. The news spread like wildfire. Everyone was talking about it, but no one, not even Eisenhower, understood why. Why had the Canadians succeeded where others had failed? What made them different? The story of what happened at Juno Beach started long before that moment. It started with a man named Guy Simmons, a man who many had written off as inexperienced and unremarkable. Simmons had only risen to the rank of lieutenant general a year earlier, and many believed he was an unlikely choice to lead the Canadian Second Corps. He had no combat experience before 1943. But as the war wore on, Simmons proved himself to be more than just a commander. He had a mind for tactics that few could match. And while others focused on the same old methods of attack, Simmons was thinking outside the box. He understood that the old ways weren't going to cut it anymore. The conventional approach to battle had been to overwhelm the enemy with sheer force, massive artillery barrages, heavy bombing, and infantry assaults. It was an approach that had worked in the past, but it wasn't working now. It was too slow, too predictable. The Germans had dug in deep. They had built concrete bunkers, reinforced by barbed wire and landmines. They had 88 Plymouth guns that could tear through anything in their path. The Allied forces had been warned. It would take hours, if not days, to break through the Atlantic Wall. But Simmons had a different idea. He was not going to waste time with slow, methodical advances. He wasn't going to wait for the artillery to wear down the German defenses. He wasn't even going to wait for the weather to clear. The weather was terrible that day. A storm had delayed the invasion, but Simmons knew that waiting would only give the Germans more time to prepare. So, he made a decision. He would launch a bold, fast, and relentless attack, one that would catch the Germans off guard. At 7:45 a.m., the first wave of Canadian soldiers hit the beach. The ramp dropped, and the soldiers charged forward, running through waist-deep water toward the shore. The sound of gunfire was deafening, and the sand was littered with obstacles, steel hedgehogs, mines, and barbed wire. The Canadian forces were facing one of the toughest German defenses in the entire invasion. But they didn't stop. They kept moving forward, pushing through the hellish conditions. The Germans, expecting the same slow, methodical assault they had seen before, were caught completely off guard. Guy Simmons knew that the speed of the assault was key. The Canadians were trained to move quickly, and they did just that. They didn't hesitate. They didn't wait. They charged forward, using tanks and armored personnel carriers to break through the defenses. It was chaos, but it was controlled chaos. The Canadians had practiced for months, learning how to work together, how to communicate under fire. They knew exactly what to do. They worked as a team, using tanks to clear obstacles, infantry to hold the line, and engineers to clear mines and blow up bunkers. The German forces couldn't keep up. They were overwhelmed. The Canadians kept pushing forward, inch by inch, but they didn't stop. They knew that stopping would mean death. As the assault continued, Simmons's strategy became clear. It wasn't about brute force. It was about speed and coordination. The Germans couldn't react fast enough to stop the Canadians, and that was the key. The Canadians didn't give the Germans time to regroup, time to adjust, or time to counterattack. They kept pushing, using their momentum to break through the German lines. Within 47 minutes, the Canadians had achieved what seemed impossible. They had breached the Atlantic Wall. They had done it faster than anyone thought possible. But even as the victory was secured, questions lingered. How had the Canadians done it? What had made them different? Why had they succeeded where others had failed? The Americans, the British, and the Germans all had their theories. The Americans believed it was because the Canadians had been trained differently, more prepared for the challenges they faced. The British believed it was because the Canadians had a natural aggressiveness that allowed them to charge forward without hesitation. The Germans, meanwhile, were stunned. They hadn't expected anyone to break through so quickly. They had believed their defenses were impenetrable. The answer, though, was simpler than all that. The Canadians had succeeded because they had a commander who was willing to take risks, to challenge the conventional wisdom, and to lead his men with confidence and vision. Simmons had seen the failure of the old methods. He knew that the Germans were ready for a slow, methodical attack. He knew that the only way to win was to do something they hadn't seen coming, and so he did. The victory at Juno Beach was a turning point. It was the moment that the world realized that the Canadians were a force to be reckoned with, but it was also the moment that the world began to understand just how much the Canadians had been underestimated. No one had expected them to succeed. No one had believed they could do it, but they did. And in doing so, they changed the course of the war. As the hours passed and the invasion continued, more good news followed. The Canadians had not only broken through the defenses, they had also reached their objectives faster than any other force. By the end of the day, they had advanced further than anyone had thought possible. The Canadians had not just proven themselves, they had proven that they could achieve the impossible, and that would make all the difference in the days to come. But what made this victory so surprising wasn't just the speed of the attack. It was the way the Canadians had worked together as a team. Every soldier, every officer, every tank, every engineer, everyone had played their part. The Canadians didn't just fight to win, they fought to help each other, to protect each other, and to ensure that everyone made it through the day. They fought with a sense of unity and purpose that no one had expected. They fought not just for victory, but for each other. And in the end, that was what made all the difference. The morning after the breakthrough at Juno Beach, the sun rose slowly over the horizon, casting long shadows on the bloodied sands. The heavy fog that had wrapped around the coastline was beginning to lift, revealing the scattered remains of a battle that had seemed impossible just hours earlier. The sound of gunfire had mostly died down, replaced by the low hum of military vehicles and the quiet murmur of soldiers moving forward, cautiously but with determination. The Canadians had broken through the German defenses faster than anyone had imagined, but the war was far from over. They had taken the first step, but the road ahead was long, and the Germans were not going to give up without a fight. Lieutenant General Simmons, now standing in the midst of the chaos, surveyed the scene before him. The beach was a mess of wrecked tanks, burned-out trucks, and debris scattered in every direction. There was a heavy scent of smoke in the air, and the ground was littered with shells and spent bullet casings. Yet amidst the destruction, Simmons could see something that few others had expected to find so soon: hope. The Canadians had done what no one thought possible. They had broken the wall, and now they had to hold it. Simmons had learned a lot from the battle so far. His plan had worked, at least the first part of it. His decision to move quickly, to attack under the cover of darkness, had caught the Germans off guard. They hadn't expected a swift, coordinated assault. But as he stood there, watching soldiers patch wounds, clear debris, and set up new positions, he knew that they hadn't won yet. There was still work to be done. The Germans had been hit hard, but they were far from defeated. Simmons needed to build on this success, to keep pushing forward before the enemy could regroup and counterattack. In the distance, a heavy rumble reached his ears. It was the sound of tanks, Canadian tanks, rolling across the beach toward the next line of defense. They were joined by the infantry, who moved forward steadily, coordinating their movements with the armored units. The Canadian forces had made significant progress, but now, the real challenge would begin. They had to secure the beach, hold the ground they had gained, and continue the advance toward the town of Caen. The Germans were not done yet, and Simmons knew that the hardest battles were still ahead. As the tanks rumbled forward, Simmons met with his officers. They gathered around him, their faces grim, their uniforms marked by dust and blood. "We've made it this far," Simmons said, his voice steady but low. "But this isn't the time to slow down. We can't afford to rest. We've got a narrow window of opportunity, and we're going to use it." Simmons pointed to a map spread out on the ground before them. The lines marking the Canadian advance were small, but they had a good grip on the beachhead. They had broken through the first set of German defenses, but Caen, their next objective, was still a long way off. The Germans would be coming back in force, and Simmons knew they had to be ready. "We need to push forward," Simmons continued, his finger tracing the path ahead. "Our objective is clear. Caen. We need to reach it, and we need to hold it. We can't afford delays. Once we get there, we'll be able to cut off the Germans from their reinforcements, and the road to victory will be open. But that means we've got to move fast. The Germans will try to slow us down, but we'll need to keep the pressure on." One of the officers, Major-General Harry Foster, spoke up. "The enemy is regrouping, sir. We've seen some of their positions fall back, but we can't underestimate them. They'll come at us hard." Simmons nodded, understanding the concern. He had no illusions about the enemy's resolve. The Germans would not give up easily, and he needed to prepare his men for whatever might come. "We're ready for them," he said, his voice firm. "We've trained for this. We've seen what they can do. But we've got the momentum. We need to keep that, no matter what." The officers nodded in agreement, their eyes hardening with determination. There was no turning back now. The Canadians had proven their worth on Juno Beach, but the battle was far from over. They had to push on, and they had to be ready for anything. As the day wore on, the Canadians worked tirelessly to secure the beach. The wounded were taken away to field hospitals, and fresh supplies were brought in to replace what had been lost. The infantry moved inland, carefully securing each building, each piece of land. The tanks rolled on, crushing anything that stood in their way. The soldiers moved with a sense of urgency, aware that they were at a crucial moment in the war. This was their chance to change the course of history, and they couldn't afford to waste it. But as the Canadians advanced, they began to encounter resistance. The Germans, regrouping quickly, began launching their counterattacks. Artillery shells rained down, and the ground shook with explosions. The Canadians, who had been moving forward with relative ease just hours before, now found themselves in a fight for every inch of ground. Simmons was right. The Germans were not finished. They had regrouped and were now digging in. They were using every available resource to slow the Canadian advance. Simmons knew that this was the moment that would define the battle. The Canadians had proven they could break through, but now they had to hold their ground, face the enemy's retaliation, and keep the pressure on. As the afternoon wore on, the Canadians began to push back the German forces. The soldiers fought hard, advancing through the rubble of the once beautiful French countryside. They had to clear houses, trenches, and fields, but they kept moving. They had to keep the momentum, no matter the cost. By evening, the Canadians had secured the first major town on their route, Villers-Bocage. The town had been heavily defended, but the Canadians had taken it, clearing the streets and pushing the Germans back. The victory was significant, but Simmons knew that this was just the beginning. There was more work to do. As night fell, Simmons gathered his officers again. The exhaustion on their faces was clear, but there was also a sense of quiet pride. They had done it. They had broken through the German defenses, and now they were moving forward, taking control of the land. But Simmons wasn't ready to rest yet. "We've made progress today," he said, his voice steady but filled with purpose. "But tomorrow, we keep pushing. We're not stopping until we reach Caen." The officers nodded in agreement. There was no hesitation now. The momentum was with them, and they were going to use it. The Germans would try to stop them, but they were ready. The Canadians had proven they could do the impossible, and they were going to do it again. Simmons looked out across the battlefield. The air was thick with smoke, and the sound of distant artillery echoed across the land. The night was cold, and the ground beneath their feet was hard and unforgiving. But in that moment, Simmons knew that they were on the path to victory. The Canadians had shown what they were capable of, and now they had to finish what they had started. Tomorrow would be another day of hard fighting, but Simmons was ready. The Canadians had done it before. They had broken through the impossible, and they would do it again. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the smoke and dust that hung over the battlefield. The Canadians had spent the night moving through the rubble, pushing deeper into enemy territory. But as the sun rose on June 7th, the reality of what lay ahead began to set in. The progress they had made in the first hours of the invasion now felt like it had come at a terrible price. The streets of Villers-Bocage, once lined with the charm of small French houses, were now torn apart, filled with the wreckage of tanks, shattered windows, and blood-soaked earth. The Germans had not retreated as expected. They were regrouping, and their counterattack was inevitable. Sergeant Harold Marshall, who had been with the advance from the start, felt the weight of the day pressing down on him. His company had taken heavy losses. He had watched as men who had stood next to him just hours before now lay motionless on the ground, their faces frozen in expressions of pain and confusion. The sound of artillery and gunfire had been relentless, and even now, the distant rumble of more explosions reached his ears. The Germans were not done fighting. The Canadians had only breached the first line of defense, and now they had to hold their ground against an enemy that was still very much alive, still very much willing to fight, despite the sense of accomplishment that had filled him the night before. As Marshall stood there, watching the chaos unfold, he couldn't shake the feeling of dread that hung in the air. The Germans had regrouped and were reinforcing their positions. They had retreated only so far, and now they were preparing for a counterattack. Marshall could feel it in the air, a tension so thick it seemed to choke the very breath from his lungs. He had been through battles before, but this felt different. The Canadians had never been so close to victory, yet the enemy was still powerful enough to take it all away. In the distance, he saw the first signs of the German counterattack. A small group of soldiers, barely visible through the smoke and haze, began to move across the field. Marshall's heart raced, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle slung over his shoulder. The Germans were getting bolder, their movements more aggressive. And then the noise came, the unmistakable sound of German tanks, their heavy treads crunching through the dirt as they rolled forward, their engines growling like beasts hungry for blood. The Canadian forces had expected this. They had been briefed on the possibility of a German counterattack, but no amount of preparation could ever make you truly ready for the brutality of war. Marshall's men were already tired. Many of them had been fighting for hours, moving from one position to the next, always under fire, always at risk, and now they were about to face an enemy reinforced by tanks, artillery, and fresh troops. They needed to hold, but could they? Major-General Simmons, who had been coordinating the assault from behind the front lines, knew the Germans would throw everything they had at the Canadians, but he also knew that the Canadians were different from the other Allied forces. They had a drive, a purpose that no other army could match, and now, more than ever, they had to prove it. There was no turning back now. Artillery shells rained down, shaking the ground as they exploded around the Canadians, each blast a reminder of the battle still to be fought. But even as the shells fell around them, the Canadians moved forward. They had been trained for this. They had been prepared for the worst, and despite the terrifying sounds of war, they didn't stop. They pressed on, unrelenting, fighting through the chaos to maintain their hard-won ground. But the Germans weren't going to make it easy. As the Canadians advanced, they encountered more resistance. The German forces had set up traps, anti-tank weapons, machine gun nests, and snipers hidden in the ruins. It felt like every step forward was a step into a deadly trap. Marshall could see his men moving forward, only to be cut down by fire from unseen enemies. The snipers were the worst. They were quick and efficient, taking out soldiers without warning. A man would drop, his face frozen in shock, before anyone even realized where the shot had come from. Despite the overwhelming odds, the Canadians didn't give up. Marshall pushed forward with his men, leading the charge, moving from cover to cover, trying to find ways to break through the German lines. But as the hours passed, the progress slowed. For every meter they gained, the Germans fought back twice as hard. The tanks were a constant threat, their powerful guns tearing through the landscape, sending shockwaves through the ground. The soldiers crouched low, using any cover they could find, but there was nowhere to hide from the tanks. The fear that had gnawed at Marshall earlier in the day began to grow stronger. They were stuck. They had gained ground, but now it seemed like they might lose it just as quickly. By mid-afternoon, Simmons received word that the Germans had regrouped and were preparing to launch a full-scale counterattack. The Canadians had no choice but to hold their ground. The reinforcements were still hours away, and until then, they would have to rely on their own strength, their own determination. But Simmons wasn't worried. He knew that his men had what it took to hold the line. The Canadians had proven their strength, and now they had to hold their ground and continue pushing forward. The sounds of battle grew louder as the Germans launched their counterattack. The tanks rumbled forward, their guns firing relentlessly at the Canadian positions. The infantry followed, moving quickly, taking cover in the rubble of the destroyed town. The Canadians fought back with everything they had. The tanks fired back, their cannons roaring as they unleashed hell on the German forces. It was a brutal, unrelenting exchange, and neither side was willing to give an inch. Marshall, with his men, fought fiercely, pushing the Germans back as best they could. But the enemy was too strong. The tanks were too powerful. The Germans had the upper hand. Despite the Canadians' best efforts, it felt like the tide was turning. The Germans were pressing in, using the terrain to their advantage, and the Canadians were being pushed back. Simmons received word of the situation and quickly issued orders to regroup. The Canadians would need to dig in, fortify their positions, and wait for reinforcements. But it was becoming clear that this was going to be a long battle. The Germans were not going to give up easily, and the Canadians, despite their initial success, had underestimated the strength of the enemy. The next few days would be the true test. As the day drew to a close, Marshall found himself standing in the middle of the wreckage, his rifle in hand, his face grim. He had fought in many battles before, but this was different. The stakes had never been higher. The Canadians had done what seemed impossible, but now they had to hold their ground against a formidable enemy. And as the night began to fall, the question that hung in the air was clear. Would they be able to hold? Would they be able to keep what they had won? Or would the Germans drive them back, pushing them into the sea? The answer would come tomorrow, but Marshall knew it would not be easy. By the end of June, the battle at Juno Beach had turned into something the world would talk about for years to come. The Canadians had broken through the heavily fortified German defenses, but the war was far from over. They had succeeded, but they were not yet finished. It had been a hard fight, and the cost had been high. The soldiers had lost men they cared about, seen their comrades fall in the heat of battle. But now, in the quiet moments after the fighting had slowed, they found themselves not only reflecting on the brutality of the war, but also on what they had accomplished. They had proven themselves, not just as soldiers, but as a nation. They had shown the world that Canada was a force to be reckoned with. Lieutenant General Simmons stood in the middle of a field, looking out over the scene of destruction. The smell of smoke still hung in the air, and the sound of distant gunfire echoed in the background. The Canadians had pushed the Germans back, but the question remained. Could they hold what they had won? Would the Germans regroup and launch another attack? Or would the Canadians be able to push on and win this war? The answer would come soon enough, but Simmons couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. The men under his command had shown strength, bravery, and determination. They had charged forward despite the odds stacked against them. They had proven that when they worked together, nothing could stop them. They had made history. But there was no time to celebrate. The war was far from over. The Canadians had secured the beach, but now they had to keep moving forward. They had to take the next step and push deeper into France. And as the days went by, the Germans didn't give up easily. They came at the Canadians with everything they had. Every step the Canadians took was met with fierce resistance. Every town they entered, every inch of ground they gained was hard fought, but they kept moving. The momentum from their victory at Juno Beach carried them forward, even as the cost of the battle grew heavier. Simmons wasn't the only one who felt the weight of the war. The soldiers, too, knew they had a job to do. They had faced the German defenses and they had broken through. They had seen their friends fall beside them, but they had kept going. They had kept moving forward even when they didn't think they could. There were moments of fear, moments when it felt like the war would never end, but there was also a sense of unity. They were in this together, fighting for something bigger than themselves. They were fighting for the freedom of others, fighting to end a war that had torn the world apart. As the Canadians continued their march across France, word of their success spread. The British and American forces, who had been struggling to break through their own German defenses, now looked to the Canadians with admiration. It was clear that the Canadians had found a way to push the Germans back, and their tactics, their approach, became the subject of study in military schools across the world. The bravery and determination of the Canadian forces were recognized by commanders and soldiers alike. They had proven that courage and skill could overcome even the most formidable of enemies. But even as the Canadians moved forward, they couldn't forget the sacrifice they had made. The memories of the men they had lost would never leave them. For the soldiers, every victory was bittersweet. Each new town they liberated, each new step they took, was a reminder of the cost of the war. The faces of the fallen haunted their dreams. But they knew they couldn't stop. They couldn't let those who had died be forgotten. They had to keep fighting, for them and for everyone who depended on them. The Canadians continued to advance, slowly but surely, liberating towns and villages, pushing the Germans further and further back. The once impenetrable German defenses, which had seemed so strong just days before, now looked vulnerable. The Canadians had shown that they were a force to be reckoned with, and the Germans could no longer afford to underestimate them. As the weeks went by, the war began to change. The Germans, unable to keep up with the relentless Canadian advance, started to retreat. The Canadians didn't stop. They kept pushing, not giving the Germans a chance to regroup. Every town they liberated was a small victory, a small step toward the final goal. They had broken through the Atlantic Wall, but they knew that the true battle for freedom was far from over. Back in Canada, the news of the Canadian success spread like wildfire. The nation was proud of what its soldiers had accomplished. Families gathered around radios to listen to the updates, their hearts swelling with pride as they heard about the bravery and determination of their sons, husbands, and brothers. The stories of the soldiers' courage became a source of inspiration for everyone back home. They were fighting not just for their own freedom, but for the freedom of others, and their sacrifices were being felt across the world. The victory at Juno Beach had far-reaching consequences. It gave the Allies the momentum they needed to push forward, and it made a real difference in the course of the war. But for the Canadians who had fought and died there, it meant more than just a military victory. It meant they had proven to the world that they were capable of great things. They had broken through when no one thought it was possible. They had fought and won, and in doing so, they had earned the respect of the world. And yet, despite all the pride and recognition, there was still a sense of loss. The war had taken its toll. So many men had died, so many had been wounded. The scars of battle, both physical and emotional, would stay with them for the rest of their lives. The memories of the men they had lost, of the towns they had liberated, would never fade. The Canadians had won, but at what cost? In the years that followed, the victory at Juno Beach became a symbol of the Canadian spirit. It became a defining moment in the nation's history, a moment when Canada proved its place on the world stage. The bravery and sacrifice of the men who fought at Juno Beach would never be forgotten. They had fought with honor, with courage, and with a sense of unity that carried them through the darkest days of the war. But even as the war ended and the soldiers returned home, the questions remained. What had they truly achieved? What had been the cost of their victory? The soldiers who had fought at Juno Beach would never truly have the answers. They had done what was necessary. They had fought for freedom, for their country, and for each other. And in doing so, they had changed the world forever. The legacy of their actions would live on, not just in the history books, but in the hearts and minds of all those who would follow in their footsteps. They had shown that even in the darkest of times, even when the odds seemed impossible, courage and determination could change the course of history. And in that, they had left a legacy that would never be forgotten. The battle was over, but the story of Juno Beach, the story of the Canadians who fought there, would live on for generations to come.